Season 1, Episode 6. Welcome to Forever Break Podcast. Now, they put the ass in first class travel. Here are your hosts, Lianne and Corey.
Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Forever Break Podcast.
Yeah.
Okay guys, this week we are going to look at epigenetics and it's so fascinating.
Yeah, if you haven't heard anything about epigenetics, prepare to have your mind blown. We're going on a ghost hunt.
We are indeed.
We are going to be talking with the amazing Mark Wolynn, who is a world leader in the field of inherited family trauma and the author of It Didn't Start With You.
Then we're going to do a post-interview discussion, just kind of unpacking all of the information that he's given us. Guys, it's so fascinating. You're going to love it.
Yeah. Be sure to check out the Forever Break website, foreverbreak.com, to take an even deeper dive into any of these topics, because that website is the
Quick quote.
So, today's quote is from the amazing Carl Jung, and it's also the opening quote of Mark Wolynn's book.
Who's going to say it? I've got the British voice. I've got the more David Attenborough-esque.
You go ahead.
Okay. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes.
I think that really fits nicely.
It really
Good
does.
job, producers.
Taking center stage.
Okay, so epigenetics. What is it and what does it mean? So have you guys ever wondered why you do the things that you do? We're talking about those deeply ingrained habits and thought patterns. Maybe you always sabotage good relationships or expect the worst of any situation. Maybe these patterns didn't actually start with you.
That's the basis of epigenetics. It is defined as the study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than alteration of the genetic code itself. It's a heavy definition, but we promise it'll make more sense.
Yeah, this is like science for dummies after the interview, so... each generation has the ability to activate or reject such patterns. Choosing to follow the epigenetic traits is the easier option, and breaking the chain requires mindfulness and discipline.
We absolutely go over that in our interview, so be sure to tune in for that. It is so important to understand epigenetics as we are learning, not only to be aware of what our ancestors have passed down to us, but also to know what you will pass down to the next generation. Being mindful about your thought patterns will give your future children a better start to life.
Even more confused? Good, because we are too. So that's why we're going to be talking to an expert on the subject of all things epigenetics.
It is a very rich interview. We hope that you guys enjoy it as much as we did.
Expert interview.
Mark Wolynn is the director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco. He is a leading expert in the field of inherited family trauma. His book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, is the winner of the 2016 Nautilus Book Award in Psychology and is also a bestseller. It has been translated into 19 languages, so 20 total languages if you count English. Duh. His articles have appeared in Psychology Today, Mind Body Green, MariaShriver.com, Elephant Journal, and Psych Central, and his poetry has been published in The New Yorker, which is obviously our first question, so we give you guys Mark. All right, well, thank you very much. We are here with Mark Wolynn, and we are talking with him about epigenetics. Mark, how are you today?
Oh, great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's our honor, our pleasure.
Absolutely. So before we dive into our discussion on inherited family trauma, we found in some of the on your website that you actually have some published poetry. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, great. Yeah. Years ago, I started writing many years ago, and it's funny because it forms the basis for the work that I teach and do. I published poetry in The New Yorker as a young man, and in my writing, which is an everyday occurrence, I hear urgent language that can't be ignored, and I follow it. I just let the language work through me, and invariably it turns into a poem if I'm very focused on this language. And, people ask me how I write poems. The language leads, the urgent language that I follow often has a message. And it's funny because that's also the basis for what I teach people in the book, that we all have this urgent language inside us, what I call core language. Another way to explain it would be our trauma language. And this is the language that we think is ours, but it often isn't. For example, we might say, I'll go crazy, I'll be locked up, or I'll do something terrible, I'll be hated, I won't deserve to live. And we think that's just how we're wired. But this is actually generational language. Maybe our grandmother's sister was put in an institution and never got out. And because that trauma never healed, that language persists in our family history and then persists in our awareness.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, that's really interesting, that whole idea of trauma language. And I love that you're kind of combining, like, it's your scientific knowledge and then also your creative outlet as well. It's kind of like bringing the two worlds together, which sounds really cool.
Exactly.
So moving on to understanding epigenetics, because I honestly, researching this, we are completely beginner to this subject. And according to Google Trends, epigenetics seems to be a relatively new field of study. Now, can you help us and our listeners better understand what exactly epigenetics is and how it relates to your field of work?
So epigenetics is this idea that the events or the gene expression, technically the stress response of our parents and grandparents can transfer forward and pass forward to the offspring, the children and the grandchildren. Now, it's not the genetics doesn't change, but how the genes express does change in relation to a trauma. So if the trauma is severe enough, our parents or grandparents will adapt to this trauma. For example, let's say our grandparents come from a war-torn country and there's bullets flying and bombs going off and people being lined up in the street and uniformed men taking our loved ones away. Our parents would have a trauma response. Our grandparents would have a trauma response. And that might be sharper reflexes or quicker reaction times, or they're learning to duck whenever there's a loud sound. And in other words, they're having an alteration internally in the biology. Literally, there's a chemical change in the DNA. And this can be, the skill set, let's say, can be passed forward to the future generations. Now, it's not changing the structure, the sequence of the DNA, but it is changing how the genes are expressed. And that expression, that gene expression, is actually an inherited stress response, to put it in a easily understandable soundbite. So we're inheriting grandma or grandpa's expression to this war trauma, but we're also inheriting a stress response with the dials set to 10. And here we are, not born in a wartime setting, but having an activated nervous system, waiting for the next shoe to fall, waiting for this catastrophe to come that never comes, but we're activated waiting for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does. And it kind of leads me to a question of what would be a circumstance that might come up in someone's life that might bring this type of thing to the surface, where they would then take that reaction and do something actively with it.
So if I talk about the very first case that led me into this type of seeing, this type of looking, I was working with this, we're going back 25 plus years. I was working with a young cutter, a young woman, a 24-year-old woman who would cut herself so deeply, and it was peculiar the way she would cut, because it wasn't a superficial cut. It was such a deep cut that she would cut a vessel, a vein, an artery, and almost bleed to death. And her parents would have to rush her to the hospital. You'll see where I'm going in a minute, because why is she having this type of response that's coming through her body in this urge, this urgency to cut? It doesn't make any sense. So as I am working with her, and I'll call her Sarah for sake of the interview, saying, Sarah, here, let me hand you a pen and pretend this is the knife, because at this point I have a detail. She's cutting so deeply, she's nearly bleeding to death. Later on, I'll be calling that nonverbal trauma language. And in a moment, we'll be acquiring her verbal trauma language. So I hand her the pen, and I say, Sarah, take this pen like it's a knife and put it to your arm and show me what's happening when you bring that knife forward. What's the feeling, the urge, the impulse, the thought? And I can watch her in the session as she brings the pen to her body, and she starts to glaze over, she starts to dissociate, and I say, stop right there, what's that feeling? And she said, I don't deserve to live. Now here I am looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. And I asked the obvious questions. Sarah, what have you done? Did you harm somebody? Did you cause an accident? Did you break up with somebody who took his or her life? And she said, no, nothing like that. And so I was flummoxed, because at this point I had no clue how to look for inherited family trauma. So I asked about her mom and her dad, and she, and her relationship with them, and she had a stellar relationship with both parents. She was able to receive her mother's love and take it in. She had a great relationship with her dad. She could take in his love. So I thought, well, then clearly this has to do with the trauma, an attachment trauma. So I asked her questions about her early relationship in utero with her mom. How was the pregnancy? How was the delivery? And I found out it was great. She has this great relationship with her mom. She was able to take in her mom's love and care, and there was no attachment trauma and no birth trauma and no in utero trauma and no early trauma.
Yeah, just like, what's going on? Yeah.
Well, thank goodness. Exactly. Yeah. And 26, 27 years ago, I'm saying, what is going on?
What do I do?
Thank goodness I asked this question, and it'll tie it all together now. The story will all come together. Yeah. I said, Sarah, tell me about your grandmother or your grandfather. And she said, okay, my grandmother was an alcoholic, and she was driving the car drunk, and Grandpa was sitting in the passenger seat. And she crashed drunk into a telephone pole. And Grandpa went through the windshield and got cut on the glass and bled to death before the ambulance arrived. And in that moment, we made an incredible link that here she was carrying two types of trauma: a nonverbal language, which is bleeding, nearly bleeding to death, cutting a vein, and her parents having to rush her to the hospital so she didn't die, and a sentence inside her of, I don't deserve to live, which immediately we knew whose sentence that was. It was the grandmother's sentence for killing her beloved, her partner. So when she cut, she was remembering something about grandfather's trauma, even though it was rarely talked about, because the grandpa had died when dad was 12, and grandma had died when dad was 20. She never met grandma or grandpa, and it was never spoken about. But here, years later, the verbal language of I don't deserve to live and the nonverbal language of nearly bleeding to death so she has to be rushed to a hospital, was a great teacher for me that I never forgot it, obviously, of course, because from then on, I would ask the questions about family history and looking for this urgent language that lives in our family history. Typical language, Corey and Lianne, would be, I'll be abandoned, I'll be rejected, there'll be no one there, I'll be left, I'll lose everything, I'll go crazy, I'll do something terrible. So I started to hear what I call in the book the core sentence, which I teach people how to be detectives to dig up this type of language and lead us into the events.
Figure it out.
The events that happened in our family history.
So that's so fascinating. And I mean, I guess this kind of actually leads us perfectly into the next question. So we watched your online video, The First Step, about confronting that family tree to see if there are any rocks that need to be turned over to find and deal with the problems. And I mean, obviously, that story is amazing, an amazing example of that you sat down with your client and you asked the right questions. Now, for anyone who might be listening who's kind of thinking, well, actually, I can kind of relate to maybe not the same, but something similar, how would they go about doing that, taking that first step?
So it's a good question, because here we are walking around with anxieties, depressions, sentences, obsessive thoughts. Really, we're walking around with a mystery that we can't explain. And we never think to separate that mystery from ourselves or our own life experience. You know, we think that we are just wired that way, and we don't turn that rock over. We don't take that step. So really, the first question is, are we sure that this depression is ours? Are we sure this anxiety started with us? You know, like the title of the book, it didn't start with you. Are we sure that these obsessive thoughts are ours? Are we sure that this OCD or this, you know, feeling of I'll be all alone, or there'll be no one there, are we sure it's not our moms or our dads or grandmothers or grandfathers? You know, I once worked with this 17-year-old boy, and he had a rare neurological disorder. And, you know, the family never thought to think that it wasn't his. He began, ever since he was 10 years old, he began experiencing burning sensations on his skin. And the doctors could find no root cause for this, you know. And so his mother came to one of my workshops, and she said, yeah, I'm really concerned about my son. He's had this terrible burning sensation on his skin since he's been 10. And the doctors, you know, they just call it a neurological disorder, and they can't, you know, they don't know what to do. So I started to ask the right questions, which were, tell me about what happened. And of course, because he was a boy, I first asked about his dad. I said, tell me about the traumas of his dad. And the mother's face went, you know, pale. She said, oh, yes. Right away, she started to make the link. She goes, oh my God, when my husband was 10 years old, he lit a match and caught the house on fire and accidentally burned the house down. And his brother, the father's brother, he actually was his twin brother, died in the fire. And the father never forgave himself. Now, because the trauma remained unhealed, I know, your skin is probably tingling. You know,
it's mind-blowing.
Right, it's mind-blowing. And
literally, I've got my mouth open.
Right. And because the trauma remained unhealed and unresolved, you know, the man's son expressed the symptoms at the same age. Yeah. And again, the family doesn't make the connection. They didn't turn over this rock. So after telling the mother, go home, tell your husband to tell his son what happened, you know, I gave them a set of practices for the boy, that every time the boy would have this sensation on his skin, he would locate inside himself the core of this itching and sort of breathe into this sensation, this burning, and breathe out to the uncle, to the father, and say, Dad, this didn't begin with me. And the father would say, son, this is never yours. It was mine. It was because I couldn't look at it. And they had a beautiful healing in the family, but the boy's skin stopped burning. And so you begin to realize that when you find the right stone, turn over the right stone, find the right story, and then do the right practice, our brains change. And I know we'll probably talk about this later, how we heal, and I think that'll be a good subject. But I want to go back again just one more time to the science, because it's so important. Something happens with our parents and our grandparents, and it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this changes the way the genes express, sometimes for generations. So literally it causes a chemical tag or an epigenetic tag. And this attaches to the DNA, and it tells the cell to use or ignore a certain gene. This is a definition of epigenetics. Something happens, the cell, the DNA tells the cell, okay, this terrible thing happened, and let's use or ignore these genes to help us deal with what happened. The problem is, so in other words, let's take it a further step down in the realm of science. So the chemical tag or the epigenetic tag will tell the cell to use these genes to protect us, to give us a chance to do better because of this trauma. Well, that's what's passed forward, that skill set. In other words, we talked about grandma and grandpa going through war, and they have now this chemical tag, this alteration that they've passed forward to help everybody down the line deal with war trauma. Just like this man would have had an adaptation because of this terrible trauma. And this information gets buried, what I found, into the family history, and then reemerges because the pieces of trauma, in a sense, they get lost, and they reemerge as bits of language, they reemerge of bits of experience, they reemerge of bits of images, and I find that they sort of reemerge in the family history, and someone later is carrying fragments of language, fragments of a story, just like this boy in his skin. The non-verbal trauma language is his skin is burning. And it wasn't his skin that burnt. It's actually the skin of the father's brother a generation earlier. Does that make any sense? So here we are inheriting bits.
It's really, really just this fascinating thing. I just can't imagine how many eureka moments you've had since you've really kind of stumbled onto this and just started knowing which line of questioning to start going down with these people. Those sessions just must be like you said, like hair standing up on your arm type of thing. It's almost like you're, searching for a ghost or something like that.
So
it's really fascinating.
That's so well put.
I am curious because a lot of what we're talking about is traumatic events. Does it have anything? Is there positive traits that can be passed along as well?
Absolutely. The skill set of being. Remember, let's go back to the image of grandma and grandpa. They may be passing on as a stress response that's not helpful for our bodies because it keeps our bodies in hyperarousal. It keeps us in fight-flight. But they're also passing forward a knowledge base, right? How to deal with an active, I'd rather be close to somebody who has the skill set of dealing with war trauma if I'm in a war situation, because their body's going to know what to do. Whereas I might just freeze. I'd rather be tagging along with this person that's inherited this skill set. So there's both positives.
It's like this almost like a superpower.
Right, exactly. Superpower, exactly, Lianne. There's both positives and negatives that pass forward. I see myself, you asked this, or you made this point, Corey, you said that there must be a lot of aha moments. Well, that's why I wrote the book, because, I've had so many experiences of people who didn't know that they weren't the source of their terrible experience. So people are walking around with symptoms and behaviors they can't explain. And I sort of see myself as the guy with the flashlight, first saying, are you sure these symptoms and behaviors, are you sure they begin with you? Number one. And then I then help people, both clinicians and non-clinicians, recognize the importance of looking at generational trauma and its biological effects on subsequent generations. So, that's why I have people look for trauma language, both verbal and nonverbal. In fact, I teach the reader of the book, and I'm teaching the listeners right now, hopefully, how to become detectives and uncover this trauma language in their lives that may stem from a traumatic event that has nothing to do with them. That's from a previous generation.
I mean, what a weight off your shoulders.
Say it again?
What a weight off people's shoulders, to maybe you've gone X amount of time in your life thinking, oh, there's something wrong with me. And then actually, you ask the right questions and you uncover like, oh, actually, I'm completely fine. I just need to break this habit and this feeling. It's amazing.
Exactly. Because that's, I keep saying this, but we're walking around with these unexplained fears, these unexplained anxieties, and they're not always ours. They're the residues of trauma in our family history, that's for sure. And they've been biologically inherited, that's for sure. but they didn't originate with us.
Awesome. And so we've talked so much about the inherited traumas and things that we get passed down to us. And in your work, we know that you talk about childhood events and even birth and how those can also have a similar effect.
Yes.
Now, can you talk a little bit more about these things that happen to us that we may not know about as an adult and how that affects us?
Absolutely. And thank you for that. It's such a good question because I don't just work with inherited trauma. I also work with early trauma, birth trauma, in utero trauma, traumas during the pregnancy, traumas during the delivery, traumas when we're little, and there are lots of them. For example, we've been in an incubator, or mom and dad took a vacation when we were too little, and they didn't realize back then the effect it would have on our difficulty trusting mom's love when she came back, or mom lost the baby before us. So when she was pregnant with us, she was saying, don't die, or I hope I don't lose you too, or oh my gosh, I can't feel the baby kicking. And these traumas create, or these emotions create cortisol. Actually, they stimulate a cortisol response. So the baby becomes flooded with mom's stress. And the cortisol can feel caustic to the baby to the point where, and I think I talk about this in the book, the baby develops a cortisol busting enzyme to deal with mom's stress. And so what you have are these early traumas from mom and dad breaking up, mom losing her brother when she's pregnant with us, mom's father dying when we're a year old, dad and mom splitting up when we're 3 or 4 or 5. And then because it took mom's attention away from us, now we have a difficulty or a challenge feeling safe and secure in life. Because when mom's connection is cut off, the child can have a difficulty trusting the feeling of who he or she is inside. We have the difficulty trusting the feeling of who we are inside because our inner experience of ourselves is dependent on mom's attunement. But if mom's attunement got pulled away because she and dad are fighting, dad's drinking, someone's cheating, now we have a break in the attachment, which can be felt not just like a break in the bond with our mother, it can also be felt like a break in the bond with ourselves. Heinz Kohut, the psychoanalyst, says how the gleam in our mother's eye is the vehicle for how a child develops in a healthy way, healthy narcissism. But if we're cut off from mom's gleam, mom's presence, we could be cut off from the core of our body, our gut feelings. And that can have a lasting impact. So thank you for bringing that up, because I work with these early insults, these early events, as well I lead the reader. The book is kind of two-pronged. The reader is saying, okay, there's two types of trauma language. And I think this is a good idea to talk about it. There's a good place to talk about it right here. There's two types of trauma language to listen for. There's generational trauma language. For example, I'll hurt somebody. I'll do something terrible. I'll be ostracized. I'll be hated, because that happened to somebody. Or there's developmental trauma language, attachment language, like I'll be abandoned. I'll be rejected. I'll be given away, because that's what happened early with us and our mom, or our mom and her mom, or our dad and his mom. Remember, 3 generations. So we can inherit mom's developmental trauma or dad's attachment trauma and experience it in our body as though it's us and our mom. You get that? Does that make sense?
It is honestly.
Mom. Yeah, our mother was put in an orphanage, but we feel like we were put in an orphanage.
Interesting.
That is just such a unique science, and just being that it's such a modern discovery is just crazy. And I just think it's so phenomenal what you're doing. So I'm just like sitting here in awe listening to this. And thank you.
I'm thinking as I'm listening, I'm like, okay, from now on, I'm going to start just looking into this, looking for the signs and questions and this actually brings me on to a question I had. So I studied film and cinema in university. And I enjoyed it. I loved it. But now when I watch movies, I break down movies as if I'm still studying them and I'm analyzing them. And I'm just wondering, this is such a fascinating subject. Do you often find yourself, in your everyday personal life, does your inner scientist come out, maybe even at impromptu times, and you're like, oh, I wonder if this is this or this, is it hard to switch off?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't turn the switch off, just like you said. You watch the movie Coco. Remember the cartoon Coco?
Is that the Mexican kid?
Do you remember?
And he plays the guitar.
Yeah. The little Mexican animated.
Yeah.
Right. It's absolutely a beautiful movie to look at our generational inheritance. But really, when you look at most movies, you start to ask this question. And when you look at the traumas that people experience, I find myself trying to do research in their family history. You read about maybe a serial killer or somebody who has experienced or has done something terrible. Mm-hmm. And then you look in the family history and you can see that, I could give a gazillion examples, but I don't want to sidetrack us of common day traumas and the experiences in their families. But
if I was at a dinner party with you, Mark, I would absolutely just be like, so I was like scratching the back of my leg and I can't stop. What do you think that might be?
Yeah, right. Tell me.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about this when you were talking about, go ahead.
No. You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So when you were telling the story of Sarah, I was thinking about this, and it got us to your slogan. It didn't start with you, but it can end with you. And you, obviously, with your work, you're really trying to go to the root cause, which I, just on a personal note, think is missing in a lot of medicine practices these days. But can our minds really break free from these problems that were passed down? Is it really possible for us to recognize that this has happened in the past and I'm the generation that's going to put a stop to it?
Absolutely. So I want to answer this question, but I want to bring in the science first.
Yeah, please do. We love
because
it.
I feel like I've only given the bad news that we're all in the same boat and it's sinking.
This is the life raft.
A lot of exactly. There's a lot of good news right now because researchers are able to reverse the trauma symptoms in mice, and one of the reasons that we're studying mice is because mice and humans share over 90% of a similar genetic makeup. So 92, 93% of the genes in humans have counterparts in mice. Plus, you can get a generation in mice in 12 to 20 weeks, where it takes 12 to 20 years to get a generation in humans. It's harder to study humans. So what they do is they cause adversity. They cause adversity to little mice, which isn't nice, but they do. They expose them to negative experiences, and the mice will have a 3-generational effect. The mice response. In other words, the trauma can be carried in the sperm or the egg and can express for 3 generations. And what they're finding now is when they take those same mice that they've traumatized in labs, and then they expose the mice to positive experiences, it changes the way the DNA expresses. Technically, it inhibits the enzymes that cause DNA methylation and histone modifications, which are 2 of the transfer mechanisms. There's other transfer mechanisms, which I think I'll talk about too, because if our listeners are scientifically minded, they need to know about this. Yeah. But first, let me give you an example of some of the research that's out there. So there's a woman in Switzerland named Isabelle Mansui, Mansui, and she's doing some amazing research at the Zurich Brain Institute at the University of Zurich. And so what she's doing is, for instance, first she's traumatizing the mice. For example, she might separate them from their moms. Okay. And then she might, not even for a long time, maybe 2 to 3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life. And then the mice, they start to exhibit behaviors that we would describe as depression in humans. And some of the mice, they as the mice age, they seem to worsen. And some of the mice don't express the behaviors themselves, but they appear to epigenetically transmit the behavioral changes. Some of the male mice sent it onto their female offspring. That would be like dads going off to war and their daughters experiencing dad's trauma, his shaking, his shutdown, his depression, his fight or flight mechanism. So it's not just that. So it's not just males passing this on to females. Males pass it on to males. Females pass it on to females. Yeah. In other words, trauma is an equal opportunity employer. Mothers and fathers equally can pass trauma to their children and grandchildren. But let me just say this. So Isabelle Mansui found that and the effects can be found for 3 generations. That's what I want to bring up. But she found that when you place these traumatized mice as adults in positive, low-stress environments, the trauma symptoms reversed and the behaviors improved. In fact, there were changes to the DNA methylation, which prevented the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation. But she's also doing this interesting research with humans right now. And she's looking at another mechanism called small non-coding microRNA. So I'm just going to talk about this for a minute because it's important. So we have DNA and we have RNA. And RNA is copied from DNA, and it acts as a messenger to instruct the cell's ribosomes to produce specific proteins. And then, so the proteins are how the genes activate or silence. So cells also contain small non-coding RNA that don't produce proteins, but they piggyback on the messenger RNA, either interfering with or amplifying their function, causing more or less of these proteins to be produced. In other words, more or less of genes to be activated or silenced, helping us deal with the trauma. Okay. So she places these mice, she traumatizes them or traumatizes their mothers, and then returns them to each other. And she sees that you can see the stress for 3 generations. But then she puts them in a positive, low-stress environments and see that not only do they not exhibit the behavior, but their fearful epigenetic signature changes, and they're no longer passing it to the future generations. And she's finding changes in the non-coding RNA.
Wow.
So what's cool here is she's now looking at humans. And this is what's amazing. She's doing 2 studies that I know of that are current. She's looking at the blood and saliva of humans, survivors of, remember that attack in 2015 in Nice, where that guy drove his van onto the promenade and he killed 80 people?
Yeah.
Well, she's a terrible thing that happened, and she's looking at the blood samples of the survivors. And she's saying, aha, there's correlations in the blood of the traumatized mice and the traumatized people. Well, she's also looking at the blood samples of Pakistani orphans who've experienced, terrible early life experiences, similar to what we experience when we lose, when we have an unpredictable separation from our mother. Mm-hmm. And she's saying, oh my goodness, here's changes in the levels of fatty acids in the orphan's blood and in the saliva. And there's also the same changes in the traumatized mice, but there's also changes in the small non-coding RNA alterations. So similar biomarkers in mice and children.
Wow.
Now let's put it all together. So here we've got humans and mice that have just gone through terrible trauma, and they're having expressions in their DNA, chemical expressions, which is causing these non-coding RNA alterations. Mm. And then she's putting them in positive experiences, in positive situations, and they're changing. They're healing. And they're not passing forward the fearful epigenetic signatures to the future generations. So I know I answered this in a long way. I'm so sorry.
No,
I think that it's really good. We need to be educated.
What's important here is now how we heal, how you heal, how I heal. Yeah. We need to have positive experiences that can calm down that stress response, whether it's inherited or whether it happened to us in utero or in our childhood.
Yeah, you're stopping the train. It's like stopping the line, saying, simply. Okay, we've done. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm going to elaborate just a little bit. So we need to have a positive experience, like mindfulness or experiencing gratitude or having a gratitude practice or having a loving kindness practice or a generosity practice or a compassion practice. And then we need to make it a daily practice. Yeah. We practice it, I'm going to say it so simply, 6 minutes a day, 6 times a day. For 1 minute, we experience a feeling of calm, comfort, a feeling of support, compassion, a feeling in our mindfulness practice of peace, an inner experience of pulsing, buzzing, expanding, opening, unwinding, flowing. And we stay with that feeling, let's say, of buzzing and flowing at an inner body level, at an energetic level. And we do it, let's say, 6 minutes, 6 times a day for a minute each time. Then we can override that stress response that keeps us stuck in a state of suffering. In other words, when we practice the new feelings and the new sensations of this new experience, we can not only create new neural pathways, but we can begin to stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine in our brain, or we can stimulate the release of feel-good hormones like estrogen or oxytocin. Mm-hmm. We can even change the way our genes, those genes that we inherited, not the genes, but the gene expression we inherited, we can start to change that too. In other words, we can downregulate the stress response, the limbic brain. We can calm ourselves. we can change our trauma brain into a peace brain.
Nice.
I really like that. I mean, you absolutely nailed. I mean, this entire season of episodes, the overall arc of it is mindfulness, and the fact that this just ties into that. The healing side of this ties into that so conveniently is just amazing. I am going to do something here where I'm going to. My brain just started going as you were talking, so I'm going to kind of combine two of these questions because I think they kind of play into each other, and it's thinking about the future of your field. Where do you see epigenetics heading in the next 10 years? And looking at that and kind of hearing what you were just talking about, it got me thinking about the idea of, has somebody at this point found this as like some sort of defense for like a legal case? If they were in court for something that they might have done that was really wrong, has somebody maybe tried to lean on something like this of, I couldn't help it. This was passed on to me. This was in my genealogy already. I can't be to blame for this.
I love your question.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I love your question. So the first part of that question, where do I see the future going? So we've got to combine the study of epigenetics and neuroscience, right? That's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about the importance of mindfulness, or, in my book, I teach this mindfulness of feeling support and comfort where there was none, as a way to use that as a meditation. Even to feel it from the ancestors, where there was none, where there's just a hole behind us because we're angry at our mother or father or something like that. So we don't look behind us. Where we can use this generational comfort and support. So combining the fields of epigenetics and neuroscience, so that we can have these experiences that pull traction away from the midbrain, the limbic brain, and bring engagement to the forebrain. Because these feeling states like compassion or gratitude, they feed the prefrontal cortex, and they can help us reframe the stress response, or downregulate or calm the stress response. And so that's got to happen. So that's the first part of the question. And another reason why I wrote the book, it's very science heavy, but it's not. I put all the science in chapter 2.
Yeah.
Skip chapter 2.
There you go. Hot tips, everybody.
Your trauma language.
That's a nice tip for everyone.
Yeah, hot tip. If you don't like the science, skip chapter 2. But and then start to do your detective work. But I also amassed all the science so people can say, oh man, this is like, the reason I need to do this is I've got to down-regulate my stress response, which I inherited, which takes us to the second part of our question. I would love to see the person that we prosecute and place in jail as the criminal and hate him. What we do is we take our criminals and we villainize them, of course, because we live in a type of a split of good and bad and right and wrong. I'd like to open that conversation up a little bit to where we look at, rather than calling this evil, calling this a predisposition, an inheritance of an epigenetic precursor, an epigenetic proclivity toward doing something terrible. You see it all the time. Dad cheats and he's rejected. The son hates his dad because his dad hurt the mom. And then the son cheats. Grandfather took a life. And then 2 generations later, grandson takes a life. Grandmom gives away children, and daughter aborts children, right? We see this all the time. There is a connection. We know it because it's been studied. It's these cunning coincidences. Even looking at the Kennedy family, which is bizarre, right? Looking at any of these families, I mean, we could, you said if you had me at a dinner party, I'd go, at a dinner party, I'd be telling you about all these families that we know and all these big cases that we know. And how if we looked beyond the naming and the judging and stopped judging, but opened up the conversation to include what happened to them.
Yeah. And I mean, I
then
guess
we've got a real conversation that could bring
brings
healing.
us back to your idea of healing from the root. Exactly. It's like looking at that person who we've prosecuted, that's saying, okay, they did something wrong. This is the reason why. Are we going to best heal them instead of carrying on punishing them, which is just draining on everyone? It's like, okay, well, we're going to look at steps on healing, and we're going to fix the problem instead of like ostracizing whoever created the problem.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Exactly. And I have to say, we're responsible for what we do.
Yeah.
So there is a consequence for what we do. We have to pay the price for what we do. But then, just like you said, opening up the conversation and letting healing trickle down to his or her family and the victim, the family of the victims. Mm-hmm. I think a very good example of how this healed happened about 15 years ago in the Amish community, when a man, I don't know if you remember this was in rural Pennsylvania, I think, where a man took a gun and shot 11 young Amish women. And then he shot himself. And the family of the survivors, of the Amish families that lost their daughters, broke bread with the family that lost their killer, right? The murderer.
Yeah.
And they all sat down together and broke bread. In fact, the Amish family members went to his funeral. And all of a sudden, when I heard this, I was had this feeling inside, this goosebumpy feeling inside of, why can't we do that? Why can't we, instead of villainizing and hating, why can't we heal and bring healing to the next 3 generations rather than continue the cycle of violence and retribution and revenge?
That just hits so hard, because you can sit there and dwell on it. You can just live the rest of your life in anger or fear or all these negative emotions, or kind of circling back to what you had said, start coming from a place of compassion, coming from a place of mindfulness, and asking the question, why? Why would this person do that? And I don't have to blame his brothers and sisters and the rest of his family for this, but we're all in pain probably, so we can experience that together and kind of start the healing as a whole. So what an amazing thing.
Yeah. And I guess that brings us to our final question. So you've talked about what inspired your book already, so we'll skip that side of it. But your book, it didn't start with you. What kind of people would benefit most from reading your book?
So, as I said earlier, most of us are walking around with this mystery that we can't explain. And we don't know why we're afraid we'll hurt our child. We don't know why we are terrified of becoming pregnant. We don't know why we're afraid of having a marriage. Simply put, I can give this easy example. If grandma died in childbirth and the baby lived, 2 people feel like they've murdered grandma. Grandpa, through his sexuality, and the baby who got to live and grandma died. So later in the system, we could see males afraid to impregnate a woman without knowing why, because she could die. And we could see females afraid of getting married, lest they get pregnant and die, without ever making the connection. So just, it's such an easy example, but it really ties it all together. Who would benefit from this book is anyone with anxiety, depression, or feelings they can't explain, or symptoms that they can't explain. Like the boy who had burning on his skin, like the woman who was cutting and didn't know why she cut so deeply or why she deserved to die. We have these mysteries. It's funny that thank you, Lianne, for bringing it up, because I wrote the book for 2 reasons. One, to help us, those of us who struggle with the mystery we can't explain. And Corey, to your question, and then I wrote it for the future to create more awareness into the medical and scientific community to open up the door, and also the legal community to open up the door and let us all breathe a little bit more.
Yeah.
That's so good.
I mean, I'm sure I can speak for obviously myself and perhaps a lot of our listeners right now. I am definitely going to read it out of sheer curiosity and fascination because it's so interesting. And I promise I won't skip chapter 2.
Yeah. Mark, if you ever get bored with studying epigenetics, go into sales because you just pitched your book so fantastically.
Without meaning to. Yeah. I'm absolutely fascinated.
Run into my Kindle.
Yeah.
That's so funny. I'm sorry. You can tell I'm pretty passionate. Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
helps, right? Yeah.
No, and that's obviously where, I mean, if you're selling a product that you're really passionate about, and you don't even have to, you can just sit there and talk about it. And I think that it's such a fascinating thing. I think people are just going to be just so intrigued by it. So
it applies to everyone, doesn't it?
Bringing us into your world. Thank you for, bringing us a little bit deeper into this knowledge and just overall your time. And we really appreciate it.
Yeah,
so
thank you
Mark.
very much.
Well, thank you for having me, Corey and Lianne. I appreciate it. I enjoyed the questions and totally enjoyed our conversation.
Interview digestion.
Wow. Just wow. Is everyone else as mind blown as we are?
Unbelievable.
The whole way through, do you know what kind of thought came into my head? Has anyone watched that Africa episode with on David Attenborough, the one with the elephants?
Of course.
Obviously. So it just made me think, why is this such a new subject? Why has this not been researched more? Because obviously people have researched this epigenetic behavior between animals. So on this episode of Planet Earth or Africa, this elephant the whole herd is starving or they can't find any water. And there's this elderly elephant in the herd, and she had never actually walked that path before across this desert to find this hidden water source. But actually, Sir David explains that one of her ancestors had done it. And so somehow that information was passed down to this elephant that was still alive in this herd. And she'd never done it before. And it just made me think, it's obviously... it's like the maternal instinct or the survival instinct in animals that's been passed down, hasn't it?
There were these links that, we sat and talked with Mark for probably a good half hour after the interview because we just kept having more and more questions, and we got into a behavior that I have of a little bit of an OCD thing with cleaning in the kitchen, and I know that my dad has the same type of thing, and so we started asking him about that, and he started asking me the right questions and just linked it to a family trauma that happened in my family's history when my dad was 18 and my grandpa died in a car accident, and how my dad had to become this perfect child so that he could be noticed by my grandma. And all of this stuff just started making so much sense. So if you've got a weird trait, if you've got something going on that you just can't figure out, start asking these questions, and by all means, get Mark's book. This is just so cool.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it?
I love it.
Take it further.
I mean, if you guys are interested in learning more, which we are, like Corey just said, Mark's book is a great place to start. As you heard Mark say, he's trying to encourage people to ask those questions and become detectives of their own lives. So the book is called It Didn't Start With You. And, his personal examples and relatable style really helps to break down such a technical topic. I'm not sciencey at all, and now I want to be an epigenetic researcher. But we will make sure we link this book in the show notes on the website so you guys can access it as easily as possible.
Yeah. You can also visit Mark's website, markwolynn.com. That's markwolynn.com. Check it out in the show notes, and there's some great videos, or find one of his mini workshops that take place all over the globe. This is a relatively new field. Interestingly enough, it also linked back to the episode that we have on sound and listening, because she was talking about how there's generations deep in some of the healing that she does.
Yeah.
So really cool stuff. We're just finding all these links, guys.
To mindfulness. Who would have thought?
Just amazing stuff.
And I always thought mindfulness was just something hippies like to do.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. I am sure we can all agree that was a fascinating topic.
We can indeed.
You can learn more about Mark on his website, markwolynn.com, where Mark has not only information about courses and workshops, but also some free video lessons and information about epigenetics. You can also do what we did and get his book, It Didn't Start With You, which is available for Kindle or in all other book forms.
If you loved this episode, make sure you check out episode 7, where we are going to be exploring listening and sound, how sound therapy can be used, and how important sound is to soothe not only our souls, but also our brains. Thank you again for listening. We appreciate you. And over to Mr. Voiceover Guy.
My pleasure. Subscribe now to the Forever Break podcast on your favorite platform: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and more. If you enjoyed this episode, help us out and leave a 5-star review. And remember, you can find all the juicy details discussed in this episode in the show notes at foreverbreak.com/podcast.